Hello. Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Sari Boren.
Hi.
Not on Long Island, hailing right this minute from Cambridge. So thanks, Sari, for coming on. And usually the way I like to start is to have people talk a little bit about their background. So if you could, let's start with that, and then we'll launch into the conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for inviting me, Paul. So my background in museums was, I got into museums before the whole museum studies sort of movement. So I'm of the generation as of you who sort of found our way into museums. I'd been working in video production for years. In the corporate side, decided I wanted to get into education, went to school to get a master's in education in thinking I was going to into video production. And I ended up writing a paper that was based on an exhibit at the Computer Museum in Boston, which no longer exists. Realized that the director of exhibits was somebody I knew from college. I needed an internship while I was in grad school, contacted him, did an internship at the Computer Museum, and realized I had found my people. And happily for me, they actually created a job for me when I graduated. So I do have a background in education, sort of formally, a master's in education, but really everything I learned on the job at the Computer Museum, where I was for 3 or 4 years. I got to go to some professional conferences. I went to some Aztec conferences, which, when you're a new professional, very helpful. Then I left went to, unfortunately, the Computer Museum went bankrupt. And right before that, I went to work at an exhibit design firm, and then left that firm with 3 other people, and we formed our own exhibit design firm, Wonder Cabinet Interpretive Design, in Massachusetts. So I was a partner and the exhibit developer and writer there for 15 years. And then we decided to shut our doors at the end of 2013. And since then, I have been an independent museum professional, working as an exhibit developer, writer, most of the time, and then sometimes just as a writer. So it depends how projects need me. And so I sort of come in and fit into people's projects as they need it. And so I've been in the field now. I started the Computer Museum in '94, so 26 years. Yikes.
Well, I tell you, when I was working in Acton back in the day, I used to visit the Computer Museum on top of the Boston Children's Museum. I loved that museum. I thought it was great.
I loved it. It was great. It was a great learning experience for me, because basically any idea I had that cost less than $100, they let me do. So I just kept doing things. Yeah.
So since one of your many hats is as a writer, and a playwright and all kinds of other things, fashionista, we'll focus in on the writing aspect though. And I thought it would be interesting to get your insights about both writing directly, like what you think are some things people can think about to really make writing more effective in a project, and the kinds of things that if people are working with writers and thinking about the written word in whatever, it could be digital interpretives or label text or things online, things you think that people should be thinking about related to writing. But I'm also interested in the writer's mindset, because when I think about developing exhibits, it seems very analogous to me about writing. Like there's an editing process and an iterative process.
It's very iterative.
Workshopping process, sort of. So I'm going to lob the conversation wall, or start the conversation that way, both nuts and bolts about writing, things that you think people should be thinking about, but also how your writer's mindset, what you feel you bring, or what that sort of writer mindset or that analog can bring to projects?
Sure. So starting sort of with thinking about writing an exhibit, I think any of us, whatever your sort of domain or skill set is, as part of the exhibit team, I'm probably speaking, to the converted here, but it always has to come from that point of view of what is our intended visitor experience. And so I think that in a way, some of the problems, if there's writing that doesn't seem to work well in an exhibit, it's because the writing was sort of developed almost as a standalone, or like after a lot of other stuff has been decided, rather than the fact that the writing is just one technique that has to be integrated with all the other techniques. First, it has to be integrated, obviously, with the graphic design. So that's how it physically lives most of the time in an exhibit, if it's not digital. Let's just talk about physical for now as a stand-in. So integrated in, just all the ways that it's actually a technique, and visitors are standing in front of it or sitting in front of it and engaging with it. But it has to be, when you're developing the text, you have to think about what is it next to, and what are visitors doing, and what are they looking at, and all of that. And that's hard to do. I don't always do that right away too. It's a very back and forth where you sort of start developing the text, and I'll talk about it a little later. And then you sort of have to, everything's all happening at once. This, it's such a collaborative process. And the more collaborative it is from the outset, I think the better that the text will be, because it's integrated with the overall intent. So that's the main thing. And then one thing that I like to talk about, because I'm an exhibit developer and a writer, and is that I like to think at the beginning of a project, people talk about the big idea, and I'm working on a project now where we have a big idea. I sometimes prefer to think about what is the essential question, because an idea sometimes can be more of a push than a pull. Question is like inviting people in. And even now, a project I'm working on, the big idea, there is one that we've stated, but I'm aware what the essential question is underneath. So I always like to give the example of a project I worked on years ago, which is the Bunker Hill Museum. And the essential question is, for that exhibit, why do we commemorate a battle we lost? So when you ask a question like that, and we don't even say that in the exhibit, this is for the development team, but it's implied. We're constantly, the intro panel says we lost the Battle of Bunker Hill. And at least half the people who walk into that space, it's a National Park Service site, are like, we lost the Battle of Bunker Hill, because most Americans think we won it. So the question of why did we commemorate a battle we lost is an intriguing question. And if you build a narrative around that, whether you state that question or not. So another one, for example, another Park Service site, a visitor center in Providence, Rhode Island, is about Roger Williams, and who sort of created some of the founding ideas of America, separation of church and state, and this idea of like liberty of conscience. And he existed 400 years ago. And the exhibit is called, I might not get this exactly right, but it's like 400 years of new and dangerous ideas. And the underlying essential question is, there's two of them. What was so dangerous about his ideas 400 years ago? And why are they still dangerous today? And so if you are constructing your writing sort of around that idea, rather than just like dumping facts, and especially it's very easy in history and science exhibits, just dump things, you're creating something that is more, I think, compelling and provocative for the visitor. So that's sort of my top level answer about how you approach writing, both this idea of the essential question, the integrated with the rest of the exhibit, and then sort of the most basic thing is you can't treat the text as some sort of information transfer apparatus. It can't just be this bucket you dump information in, because who wants that?
No, that's a great point. I think one thing that keeps coming out in my work and conversations with people is that, which people who don't work in museums might be surprised to think about, is that really this is not about dumping information, or this is not about information transfer. It's this interpretation and the kind of essential question that you talk about that really sort of builds up this sort of surprise or intrigue or drama
Yeah.
is really the way into it, not just like, oh, here's 50 facts about Roger Williams, or here's 80 pieces of trivia, historical trivia about Bunker Hill. It's sort of like, all right,
And
okay, we okay, I guess we saw Bunker Hill and we can leave now.
yeah, because why do we, that's our job. And so when you say from a writer's point of view, the essential question comes from this idea of a narrative. And again, not being you can't just dump all this information. So I have like I'm trying to line them with my head, a few points to make. So from a writer's point of view, there's Vivian Gornick is a sort of very well-known nonfiction writer. And she wrote a book and she talks about the situation and the story. And I think that this is for like creative writing, but it's very helpful for exhibit writing. So the situation's what happened. So for example, Paul, you and I could walk down the street and something crazy could happen. A dog could chase a turkey that jumps on someone's head, right? And that's the situation. But if you and I were to sit down and write about it, we might each write a different story, because you might have had a bad experience with a turkey once. And so you would frame your story like around my turkey experience. And I might love turkeys and like be afraid of dogs. And so I would write a different story. And so the situation, when people write exhibit text, they always think like they're just putting out the situation. But you always want to find what the story is. An exhibit has to have a point of view. To say it doesn't have a point of view is just it's not being honest. There's a point of view, but you're not being deliberate about it. And, we can talk a little bit later about this, but I would say one of the key things I would say to somebody working with an exhibit writer, whether it's a client or design team that hasn't, is there's always too much content that people want to put in the exhibit. And even I feel that. I always feel like, I want to tell this story. I want this detail. And you have to be willing to let go of some of your content and realize it's better to be more intriguing, surprising, provocative, deep on less content to inspire the visitor to want to know more later. The more you put in, the more complicated it is. And one thing I say to clients when they say, and they always agree with this when we do the outline, they always agree with this. And then once you start the writing, they're like, add this, add this, add this. And here's what I say. Just because that text, that content is on the wall does not mean the visitor's going to read it. It's our job to make the visitors want to read it. And the more you dump in, not only is it overwhelming, but it's harder to write beautiful, engaging text. If I have 75 words and 65 of those words are content words, there's no room to sort of spread out the writing and make it enjoyable and narrative and interesting. It's going to be like dense and boring. If only half of my words are like the core content, then I have more words to kind of tell a story with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's sort of paradoxical because you use the word intriguing, which I think is a good one. If we just dump and cram a bunch of information into an exhibition or a museum, there is no breathing room. And there's no incentive for somebody to sort of continue their experience after they leave the physical
Yes.
museum or exhibition. You've sort of beaten them into submission, and they're like, okay, I don't need to know a damn thing more about Roger Williams or Bunker Hill or COVID-19 or whatever it is that the subject of the museum or the exhibition is about. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, so that's very much from the writer's point of view. And as the writer and content developer, and it is harder when I come in just as a writer and someone else has done all the content development because I have less, like all of that has already been decided. But say as a creative writer, and I teach essay writing, I always say to my students, you're trying to write your way into understanding. You write to try to understand what you're thinking. When you write exhibit text, you can't do that. You have to know before. But the process before you start writing should be that process of exploration, whether you on your own, in collaboration with your full design team, the client. You're cramming all this information to your head as the writer, exhibit developer, and then you're searching. Like, that's my job. What is the narrative? What is the essential question? What is what I'm looking for? And it can be very hard to stay on that track when writing text, because there's a lot of, you're not working in isolation. I work in isolation, but then it's like, oh, here are the images we have, and here are the ones we don't. Here's how much space we have, and here's what we don't. Here's where this panel about topic A now is actually going to go in the area near content B, because we don't have room for that panel in A. What are you going to do about that? So it's all of that stuff. But I think the idea of an essential question, thinking about the narrative and not jamming too much like data into each graphic element. You want the language to have room to breathe, and I'll talk a little more about language a little later.
That's an interesting creative tension to what you just said. When I'm at the beginning of a project, I get into sponge mode. I'm trying,
Yes.
I'm trying to take in everything, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to use this, but well, that's sort of interesting, and boom, 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 you take all this in. But then you can't just sort of spit all that back out in this sort of unprocessed way, because then again, we're back to jamming things, cramming information in without any interpretation. So yeah, it's interesting, that tension too.
There's another really interesting tension. I was really lucky to get to work with the National Park Service historian, Marty Blatt, who is no longer at the Park Service, but now is actually teaching museum studies at Northeastern. And he's a wonderful guy. And I stole this from him. He talks about the tyranny of details. And the tyranny of details is when you put in, say, like a lot of dates that are not helpful. Dates can be useful as context, but like, do I need to know the date of like every battle? Do I need to know the name of every ship? Do I need to know, like, so you have to be aware of the tyranny of details. On the other hand, there are details that are illuminating, because if we think about a spectrum, on one end is like the tyranny of details, and the other end is generic, and neither one is good, like just sort of talking generically. So a great illuminating detail, and one that I worked with Marty in the Bunker Hill Museum, and he gave me a great illuminating detail for that, where we talked about the opening of the battle Bunker Hill, and one of the first cannons that the British shot took the head off of one of the Patriots. I think his name was Asa Pollard. I might be wrong about that. I'm pulling this out of the back of my head. But when we wrote the text, we're like, this volley starts and this cannon takes off this guy's head, and it freaks out. Obviously, everybody standing around him. I didn't write it saying freaked out, but that's an illuminating detail. We put visitors in the mindset of this like ragtag group of, of Patriot soldiers, and one of their neighbors gets his head taken off in the first like 5 minutes of the battle. That's an illuminating detail. If we started
or a real conversation,
or
stopper or starter,
the dimensions of like the Palisades they built, that's the tyranny details. No one cares. If the size of it's important, you would say something like, and I hate the football field thing, is like, I don't know how big a football field is, but like if you said that something was the length of a city block, that might be helpful, or something was like 3 car lengths. But the tyranny details would be somebody who's so into the Palisade building that they give you all the measurements. So that's another thing when you're writing text, is you try to find those illuminating details that like people go like, whoa, or I didn't know that, that's so interesting, or just makes it personal. Some guy got his head blown off and we know his name. Yeah.
I'll tell you, as soon as you said that, I was like, whoa, that's here we go off on the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Right, and you can imagine yourself there, right? It gives you this strong image of like, geez, what would it have been like to be like 5 feet away from that guy, That's scary. It was scary what they were doing.
Yeah, for sure. So what else, as you are either developing projects do you think people should keep in mind, or what do you keep in mind with a writer's mindset when you're developing a project?
Yeah, I mean, at its most basic, there is this iterative process. I love to work collaboratively with the team. It's harder when I don't get to. And usually, at its most basic, I start with a content outline. Usually near the middle or end of schematic design, I'll do a content outline depending on the project. And then it's iterative. It goes to the client, you get feedback. And then typically I'll do then 2 drafts of text. The first draft is always the most time consuming. So this is just like a helpful technical thing. If you're working with writers, to me, the content outline first draft of text is going to take the most time. And the first draft is really when I want the client to go through it with like a fine tooth comb and be like, no, you misunderstood this, Sari, because I am just gobbling up content, at the beginning, and I can misunderstand, the consequences of certain, what I got wrong, what's missing, like really go through it, then get all that feedback, do the second draft text. Now I'm saying, let's try not to make any major changes now, because I'm working now with the graphic designer. We're starting to figure out how this is going to go, still fixing things. And then the third or final draft sometimes is still in like something like a Word or Google document. Sometimes if it can be helpful, it's more work for the design team. But I think to get a more accurate feedback from the client, sometimes put the third draft in the graphic layouts with the images if you have it. It's much harder to review and get feedback because it's not like a Word document. You have to either mark up hard copy or mark up PDFs, and you have to blow them up on your screen and all that. But then a client can be like, oh, or even I sometimes will look at something and be like, I need to rewrite that paragraph because of how that image is, not just saying it's the right, but like, it's not integrating well, and then usually at the end you do graphic proofs, which is the same thing, but you're just looking for errors, and the idea is with each iterative event, just like design, you want to make the major changes early and try to avoid major changes later.
Well, I was just going to say something about early. This what you just described to me reinforces the idea of why you would want to bring in a writer or writers early at the beginning of the process, because you can't just sort of kludge this on or tack this on at the end if you really want things to be thoughtful and integrated. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's interesting. That to me is an argument for sort of having a broad integrated team and having all the players in early, whether that's advisors or writers or digital media people, because if you're just bringing those people in once or twice in the process or at the very end of the process, their impact on the project is going to be so minimal that it just sort of reflects, well, our priority is not writing, or our priority is not really the digital interactives. We just want a touch screen here. Just make it whatever,
well,
whatever.
It's usually when they're thinking of the text really as this knowledge transfer apparatus. It's like, well, we know we have all this content, we'll give it to a writer and they'll write it, and I mean, I've had some good relationship. Like I did a project, a Park Service project, where I was brought in to an exhibit team just as the writer, but there was a very engaged content developer who was on staff at the design firm, and she had created a very detailed outline, and we had a lot of back and forth conversation. She was very open, I would be like, there's just way too much content here, and we would talk about what to do with it. So she had done that early part of the job, but other times it can be harder. And actually I can think of the only time that I had like somebody really, like I got some really negative response to my work, and I've worked on over 50 projects, and it was sort of shocking to me. It's when I got brought in as a writer for a history project. I had like very little contact with the design team. I said to them, well, what are your graphic typicals? And they were like, you just tell us like how many words you want. And I was like, okay, well I could do, and like, they just were just going to plug my text in to stuff. And then I had very little back and forth. So all the content was just like thrown at me. And then it turned out the client was really unhappy with the text, which made me feel terrible. But I just felt like adrift, you know? It was not a good process. I felt awful about it.
It's hard to tap dance when you're handcuffed and wearing a straitjacket.
Yeah. That was a little rough, but it's almost never like that, you know, and it's always on some spectrum of, the other thing I would say to a client team is to take the review of the content outline and text seriously. And weirdly, a few times, that hasn't happened. And they sort of look at the content outline in this cursory way. And then I write the first, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm on track. And I write the first draft text and they're like, what is this? And I'm like, this is the expanded version of the content outline you approved. And that hasn't happened very often, but again, it's the same thing as looking as the designs. I think if you think about, these are in parallel tracks, and you know this, the tricky thing is that you're doing things back and forth. Things are getting valued engineered or changed. And I'm like, oh, we don't have that exhibit anymore. And I have to rethink so all of that stuff. But I think it just really starts with the high level thinking from the visitor point of view. And everybody agrees it from the outside. And the hard work is not going astray, because mid-project, like, there is just a lot of desire for more content to be put in. And and so I guess that goes to like any project. The relationship and trust you have with the team has a lot of value.
Well, and also, right at first principles, what you said, what's the engaging question? What's the big idea? What's as they say, what's the North Star that guides us? What's the thing we keep referring to? Because if you are just throwing in everything, it never, if you're starting out with a whole bunch of mushy ideas at the beginning, it somehow does not miraculously clear up in the middle of the process.
Because it will get more mushy sometimes. And the thing is, it's great when people have ideas. So I'm working on a conceptual plan now for Arboretum. And we have, our big idea has to do with like uncovering what's hidden. Because the idea is that the exhibit is to get people out into the Arboretum. You know, we had several big ideas, and there was a second one on sensory experiences that's sort of going to be integrated. And there's not an essential question, but in my mind there is. In my mind, the essential question is, what can I discover about the natural world when I learn how to be a better observer? That's sort of the essential question that's sort of underlining it. And as I've been developing the conceptual plan, it's going on right now, the client feedback has been amazing. And they have all these ideas, and the ideas, and they don't all fit under that umbrella for the big idea. It becomes kitchen sink. And so what I've written is basically saying, you know, we can't fit all these ideas, whether physically or thematically, but we hold on to them to create complementary programs. So all those other ideas that you don't want to overwhelm in the exhibit, you either hold on to them for rotating exhibits later, or you think about your complementary programs and put them into programs. And so all of those ideas are amazing, but you have to kind of keep your focus.
I think that's what you just said is a really great tip, because there again is some of that creative tension. You don't want to cut off people's ideas or enthusiasm. You want to do that, but on the other hand, the exhibit's just one medium for transferring those ideas. You know, and it's like a pack mule. If you weight it down, it's just going to collapse. And so, how to really hone and cull those ideas, and then, like you say, okay, this is a good idea. We can't use it here now, but we don't want to lose track of it. So yeah, this is a great idea for a program, or this is something that could expand on the website or a temporary exhibit, like you say.
And you know what, another great thing that you realize, what's a good essential question is if I don't always know the answer to it right away. So part of the underlying thing at this Arboretum that has come up is just, and it was one of our proposed big ideas, is what is a tree? And we decided that was too limiting, But somebody's like, well, we kind of want visitors to know why an arboretum is important. And then I thought to myself, why is an arboretum important? Like, we're just taking for granted, but that's a great question. And I think that's going to be a sub question that fits, because it is an arboretum, and it's sort of, or maybe it's a sidebar that I think is important for visitors there to know. And I'm like, I'm not even sure why an arboretum is important. And so the act of me finding out, I think, is really useful and is interesting. And then I can sort of stop talking about this, and I did want to talk a bit about actual writing, but I don't know if you have any other questions about this larger thing we're talking about before I talk about actual writing techniques.
No, hit me with a couple of writing techniques, and then I think that's a good way to wrap up our conversation.
Yep. So when you write, you have to think of yourself as a writer. And writing is a skill just like a designer, and don't give it short shrift. Do you feel like you don't have a lot of experience as a writer, take some creative writing classes and get better at it. But here are key things. Use the active voice. People say this all the time. And what the active voice means, it doesn't mean you can't use the words is and are. That's fine. You want to use active verbs when you can, but sometimes it's fine to say there are. The key thing about the active voice is to make sure you're telling who's doing something. So I have like an example here. Let me see. I thought I had an example here. But like if I said, the laws were passed without protest. It's like, well, who passed the laws? See, that's passive. Like, I don't know who the actor was. But if we say, the school committee passed the laws without protest, then like, it's like, oh, now I know who did it. That's sort of a boring example. Active voice, a really easy way to tighten your text, because we're always working in word limits, is try to get rid of prepositional phrases wherever you can. And you can often switch them to possessives. So, I can't think of something off the top of my head, but honestly, if you go look at your writing, most people write tons of prepositional phrases. See how you can get rid of those. You want to vary your sentence structure so it's not boring. So it doesn't say, Bunker Hill was an important battle. The battle was, subject, verb, subject, verb. But so you want to start sometimes with sometimes a short prepositional phrase with another phrase, but try to avoid really long, complex sentences. I love writing those sentences, but people are reading standing up, and you need to make it easy for them to actually take in. So those are sort of like my key tricks. A couple other things. If you feel like your voice is kind of boring, think about a person that you're actually writing the text for, someone who loves going to museums but doesn't know about this topic. Think about writing it for them. And then the very important thing, there's always revision. You revise first at the meta level. Look at, are you covering the right topics? Or all those big things, the paragraph level, the sentence level, and read your work aloud. The most important revision tip ever is to read your work aloud. You will hear what isn't working when you read it aloud.
There, in a nutshell. No, that's great. I echo your reading things aloud. That's what I think about when I'm writing things. It really helps, It's like, that doesn't sound right. It's funny. I was writing a blog post, and one of my sons said, "Wow, that sounds just like you when you're talking." Huh. And I said, "That's the point." And he said, "Yeah, sometimes you read things and it doesn't sound like somebody, somebody you'd want to be talking with." I said, "That's also the point." So, I think that's a great last tip, and that's a good way.
And also, just as last thing, keep in mind, a lot of times visitors are reading the text aloud to someone else. And so if it's sort of just even an awkward sentence, or you'll realize like, oh, it's not clear. Like, I need a comma in there, because otherwise, like, you don't know who's saying what or whatever. So that will help.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah. Well, Sari, thanks very much. It was great.
You.
I feel compelled, since that beautiful painting has been behind you the whole time. Just give a shout out to the artist.
This painting is by my mother, Sari Boren, who is a very talented artist who Paul and my mom got to meet because we went to an exhibit together in New York City many years ago.
James Turrell exhibit at the Guggenheim and got to lie on the floor looking up at the ceiling, the oculus of the Guggenheim at James Turrell's. Autumn Rain. That was awesome.
It was amazing. Yeah. And well, I really look forward to the day when we all get together again today in museums and enjoy our museums and enjoy each other's company in person.
Thanks very much. Well spoken. I'd read that label.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Sari. I appreciate you taking the time.
Take care. Bye.